I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review, where we use our AI, Design Eye, to analyse an old competition piece of mine and give us some idea about how it met the criteria of the elements and principles of design, as well as some suggestions for improvement of the design. This week we're looking at a very particular design. The title was Stumped, and it was for a regional agricultural show, so a little bit of country coming into the design. But also the stipulation was that you could only use 3 flowers. And given that the width was 60 centimetres, they needed to be large flowers, because using obviously small flowers, 3 tiny flowers, in a design of that dimension is not going to have the same sort of impact unless you mass them together. You could mass 3 smaller flowers together and make them very much the focal point, but it would create a whole lot of other area that you needed to fill with foliage or other plant material that wasn't the flowers. So what I determined to do was I've used a tree stump as the base, and inside of that I've got a vase that will contain water to keep the plant material fresh. Resting on top of the stump is a wire frame that I often make for weddings, and they're a hanging frame, so it's a dome shape, but I thought I'd use it turned up the other way, this way, for this design, and utilise that structure to hold some of the plant material in place, because it was in just a jar with water in it. I don't like to use floral foam, so there was this element of keeping the things in place using the structure rather than using foam or any other mechanic inside the tree stump itself. The dome has got some willow wrapped around it, which is standard for these designs. I keep them for use in weddings and other activities. I've used some conifer foliage on one side, and I've used 3 proteas, and I have kept the foliage of the proteas with the flowers that are there, so that it fills that void nicely. And then there's a little bit of Tillandsia, a bulbandpid, or Spanish moss, whatever you call it locally, that is wrapped around the top, just to mimic the colour of the stump particularly, so that that colour gets carried through and repeated in the design, and that the swirling motion of the dome is emphasised in terms of spinning around that particular placements of those plant materials. So we'll have a look at what the AI, Design Eye, has said about how it meets the principles and elements of design. I will say that this design, although it placed second in the competition, it actually won an award for the most creative design. So interesting that it was creative in terms of its interpretation, but it didn't quite meet the criteria for the principles and elements of design. So that's where I'll be interested to see what it's got to say and what improvements need to be made that would have lifted it above the first place getter, even though I was very rewarded by getting the most creative design of the show completely, not just in this class, but across the show itself. So let's have a look now at the principles and elements of design. Line, first of all. The dynamic enclosing circular frame of twigs and vine creates a strong visual flow. There's a rhythmic spiralling movement that brings cohesion while guiding the eye across the vertical axis and around the design. So the vertical axis obviously is the placement of the proteas, the foliage and the flowers, but it doesn't dissect the design. It just brings you up to where this swirling motion, because the lines of that are more dominant, it creates that movement in the design and keeps you moving around the design. And also that swirling top section, the form, the circular form, mimics the circular form of the stump underneath. Form, a massed upright form, dominates the design, visually anchored by the substantial base container. The 3 king proteas provide solid focal points, while the wirework adds contrasting delicacy. So, as I just said, the form is the upright part of the design, that big circular spiralling container, but it is anchored by the stump underneath, but also reflected in that form as well. Texture, this is a standout feature with rough bark, fine moss, wiry twigs, leathery leaves, and the plush texture of the proteas contrasting effectively to provide rich tactile interest. Now, as you know, if you've looked at any of the other videos, texture is the thing that I like to focus on in terms of my designs. That textural contrast in a design, I think, works well for me. And I'm pleased to see that this was what is considered in its analysis the standout feature, because there is really good contrast in terms of the smoothness of the leaves, of the foliage from the protea, the roughness of the tillandsia and of the bark in the stump itself. So a really good contrast of textures. Probably not so much in terms of the colours, contrasting colours, but texture is what I like to focus on, so I'm happy with that. Colour. Naturalistic earthy tones, browns, greys and greens, are accented by the pink lavender tones of the proteas, which pop gently against the rustic palette. The subtlety is effective, allowing the flowers to command attention. So it's interesting in this that had I used something that was a brighter colour and a really strong pop of colour rather than the gentle pop that these ones allow, it would have drawn, it would have made them very much the focal point to the detriment of the rest of the design. So had I used sunflowers, for example, if you think about sunflowers in this design, it would have been too much. They would have looked, in fact, out of place. Even though the form, the circular form of the flower would have been right, the colour and that too stark a contrast in terms of colour between the rest of the design and the flowers themselves would have thrown it out of balance visually. So space. The design feels full yet not overcrowded. There is thoughtful spacing of the botanical and constructed materials to create depth and visual interest throughout. So one of the things that circular dome does is gives me depth, because it extends backwards away from the stump that it's resting on, and so it gives me that depth, and it gives me depth at an eye level height. So it's an interesting way to give depth to a design, because normally we would look at depth being a little bit further down in the design, maybe halfway or throughout the design. But this one it almost makes you fall into the design, because you're looking into the design, because it extends at eye level away from the front of the design. Balance. A pleasing asymmetry is created through the arched lines and foliage grouping. The dominant right-hand floral grouping is visually balanced by the open space on the left and the arc structure. And that's an interesting note, that the visual balance, even though one part of that is very heavily populated by foliage, the balance comes from the negative space on the other side that is framed by the structure itself. So it's something to remember in terms of our designs. We don't always have to visually balance a design with plant material. That if we've got space on one side and plant material on the other, so long as it is framed completely together, there's going to be visual balance. Rhythm. Excellent repetition and gradation in the vine loops and the positioning of foliage. The visual pulse created by the circular frame and protea spacing draws the eye naturally. So this is about looking at where the placements of the proteas are, in terms of it not being spot placements, but there is a movement that follows and is mimicked by and mirrors the outside circular frame and the vine and the willow, in fact, in this case, and the tillandsia, so that it all works together, it works in conjunction with one another. Dominance and emphasis. The proteas are clearly dominant, but not overpowering. This is what we talked about in terms of colour. Their placement allows for focal emphasis without interrupting the harmony. So once again, as we talked about just in the rhythm previously, that the placement is not jarring when we look at it, that they look like they belong there. They're part of that whole movement of that design. You can see me moving around because I'm moving with the design. Hope it didn't make you seasick. Contrast. Strong contrast between rigid, curved, fresh, dry, smooth, rough, dense, open is well explored. And so this is talking once again not just about the textural contrast, but about using the space and using the line as well as to contrast with the textural contrast that is already there and is quite evident. Proportion. Overall proportions are good, though the frame leans slightly to the left, which may feel a little heavy if viewed from certain angles. And this was a problem, I remember, at the time. This is quite some time ago now that I did this design. But I remember it having trouble anchoring the frame onto the stump. And naturally enough, with all these things, you try them at home, they work perfectly at home, you get them to the show bench and they won't do what they've done perfectly at home, a bit like children really sometimes. So I know that was a problem, and what I tried to do, because I knew it was going to lean to one side, was to do the placement of the plant material so that it wouldn't be too obvious that it was leaning to one side. So interesting that it's picked that up, but it's saying only at certain angles. So I think if you had looked at it, if you were looking at the way the image is taken is the way it was judged, so straight on. But if you looked at it from one side, it would be far more obvious about the lean of that framework. And I would have to do something about it. If it was going to be judged all around, I would have to do something about that lean, make it either a feature or fix it in some way. Harmony, unified through tone, material, and a naturalistic sculptural feel. So yes, the design feels harmonious. I think probably the only thing that I might consider in looking at it now is that not enough of the plant material drapes down over the stump. So I probably would have had some tillandsia, some of the old man's beard, coming down over the stump as well to repeat that, but to soften that, the dominance of that particular part of the design. Let's have a look now at some of the suggestions that have been made to see what I could do to improve the design. So mechanics visibility. The green ties or fixing, so the cable ties or zip ties on the circular structure are slightly visible. Consider using natural toned or camouflage fixing to maintain visual integrity. Now this is an interesting point because it was a contemporary design, and you can have the mechanics showing as long as they're part of the design in a contemporary design. I think that I chose to leave them visible. I can see now that I look at it, there's a couple that are right at the front of the design, and perhaps a better green would have been more appropriate than that one, than the green that I've used. I would probably still have them there, and I would either make them the same colour as the proteas, so it was obvious that I was trying to match it in that way, or I would make them blend in as it has suggested. So, refinement of base. While the log base is characterful, a cleaner cut or underlay may have visually anchored it more elegantly. And I think that's true. I think it just needs something to finish it off. It just looks a bit stark the way it is. So that is something that I would reconsider. And the finish, some of the finer twigs and mosses could be more selectively trimmed to reduce visual noise near the base. So this, I think, is the foliage from the conifer, and perhaps it's just a little bit too dense underneath the framework there. So that is probably something that I would play around with a little bit more and see if I could get some air and some light and some space coming through that part of the design. All good suggestions, all ones that I would certainly consider to think about in terms of improving the design moving forward. That is it for the review of this particular design. If you'd like your own designs reviewed, you just go to the website and follow the instructions there. We have one of these videos come out every week where I look at old designs of mine and what I could do to improve them, what went well, what didn't go well, and I can talk to you about what I was thinking at the time that I was putting the design together. All of it's designed to help you on your floral art journey. I will leave you to continue your journey. I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Review.